The Elder Scrolls 3: Morrowind. This was Bethesda's first fully 3D mainline Elder Scrolls game, and after Bethesda as a company was having financial problems, Morrowind had a lot riding on its success, but succeed it did. So Morrowind was the last mainline Elder Scrolls game that I hadn't touched up to this point. I made videos on both Arena and Daggerfall already, and I played both Oblivion and Skyrim while in college. Ah, the fantastic college life of missing class because Skyrim released. Those videos are coming after Morrowind's here. Considering what the gameplay of Arena and Daggerfall were like, and what the series evolved into with Oblivion and Skyrim, I was wondering just where Morrowind was going to be placed. Would it be a follow-up to the first two games? Would it be the first iteration of actual real-time combat like in Oblivion and Skyrim? Or would it be somewhere in between? The answer? It takes a lot more from Arena and Daggerfall than it is a transition into what Oblivion became. Being the first fully 3D game of the mainline series, and still open world, its art style sure didn't age well at all. But even with that, there's a sort of characteristic or personality that the art helps to give the game. Stiffer animations, swapping back and forth between weapons and magic, and even some of that sweet Bethesda jank. From everything I've read online about this game's development, Morrowind seemed like it was Bethesda backed into a corner and trying to come out swinging, or go out with a bang. Come May 2002, the game released on PC in both North America and Europe. Later that year, Morrowind would also become the first Elder Scrolls game to release on a console, being the Xbox. By September, Morrowind apparently sold about 200,000 copies worldwide and was considered both a critical and commercial success. Keep in mind, this was back in 2002, back when games didn't need to sell tens of millions of copies to be considered a success. But even with a significantly reduced map size when compared to the prior games, the land of Vardenfell was still extremely large by that point in gaming. This was a fully 3D open world game on the original Xbox. Open world games are notoriously hard to make. Even by today's standards, bugs will pop up every video game. But when you switch to an open world style, those bugs multiply dozens of times over. Package that on the Generation 6 consoles, and Bethesda Game Studios performed a straight up miracle. Morrowind really pushed what consoles were capable of back when it came out. And while the art style had a lot to be desired, even back then, the trade-offs that came from it were significant enough to become the hit it was. You see, The Elder Scrolls was primarily a PC-only series up to that point. While gaming on PC was big back in the early 2000s, there was still untapped potential in the console market. That would end up putting BGS on the map for players all around the world. As time would go on, after Oblivion, Skyrim, the Fallouts, and now Starfield, there are many that would consider Morrowind to be one of Bethesda's best games they ever put out. That's extremely high praise there for the storied developer, especially after the success of games like Fallout 4 and Skyrim. But since this was the only mainline Elder Scrolls game I never touched, my only knowledge from the game was from various YouTube videos and the occasional Mickey D meme on Twitter. With the Elder Scrolls 6 finally in actual development now, I decided to try playing through all the mainline Elder Scrolls games. Having already made videos on Arena and Daggerfall, Morrowind was finally up next on the chopping block. I could finally go in and see what made this game so special to people. Special enough for many to say it's the best game under Todd Howard's direction, and it's apparently been downhill ever since. My original plan for this video was to play through all of Morrowind. We're talking the base game and the two expansions, Tribunal and Blood Moon respectively. Well, I definitely ended up biting off more than I could chew with this one. When I heard the stories about Morrowind's map size being small, I figured I could get through all the content the game had to offer in a reasonable time frame. Boy, was I wrong with that assumption. It took me over 64 hours to finally beat the main story of the base game. Just the base game. I didn't jump into either of the expansions as I planned to do them afterwards anyway. So this video is purely on the base game itself, and all the side stuff that I could do in the first 64 hours. Hi there, my name is MegaMadVlad, and welcome to my journey through all the mainline Elder Scrolls games on the path to the Elder Scrolls 6's launch. There were many games and huge experiences to be had from this series, so much so that there are people who solely create content for the Elder Scrolls. With a massive legacy like that, it's time we hop straight into Morrowind and see what makes it so beloved. So let's dive right in. Alright, So the first thing I want to say is that this playthrough is completely unmodded. Unlike what I did with Daggerfall, this is Morrowind as it is when you get its complete edition. It has all the extra patches and content that Bethesda put out in this version, but this is all BGS made, all the way down to the game being in 4:3 aspect ratio. This is Morrowind as it was made to be. With that out of the way, let's talk about the main thing games are known for, the gameplay. After your character wakes up on a ship, and you create your character, the first thing you're likely to notice is the draw distance the game has. It's abysmal. It's like you could see only 20 feet in front of you as you watch everything past that point literally get drawn in front of you in real time. And walking backwards, you end up erasing it all. I'm sure there are mods out there that can open that up a bit, but considering how old Morrowind is and the ground it was trying to break, this is probably something that needed to happen. Imagine getting Morrowind on your computer back in 2002, and you can't play it because the draw distance is too high. That wouldn't be very fun, would it? When I started up Morrowind, I wasn't sure what to expect. This was the first mainline entry under Todd's supervision. I was expecting it to depart from what Arena and Daggerfall brought to the table a bit more than what it actually shipped with. Something a bit closer to Oblivion in design. While there are some things that do bridge the gap between Daggerfall and Oblivion, in the design of the game, it had a bunch of systems that were taken from Arena and Daggerfall. Systems such as how skills are treated. So there are 27 skills in the game, and depending on what class you start the game as, will determine what's a major, minor, or miscellaneous skill. All classes have 5 major, 5 minor, and 17 miscellaneous skills associated with them. All 27 skills are tied to attributes, and even go to determine how much growth in those attributes will occur, simply by leveling the skills in question. You level your skills by using them. Long blade levels by using a long blade weapon, and getting successful hits off with it. Light armor levels by wearing light armor and getting hit by enemies. Makes sense. You essentially level by doing, something that Bethesda always iterates on in their games. All skills are attached to your character's attributes as well, and you level up your attributes when you do a character level up. Okay, I know there's a lot of talk of leveling up and skills and attributes and your character can all level up, but I promise you, it's actually easy to understand. So we're going to start with talking about how you level your character and go down from there. To level your character, you simply need to level a major or minor skill a total of 10 times. Any combination of them will do. If you hover your mouse over your character's level on your character sheet, it will tell you how many skill levels in major or minor have been achieved on your current character level. Miscellaneous skills don't add to this, but there's something very good that comes out of that we'll talk about in a bit. So after you level up any combination of major or minor skills 10 times, all you need to do is rest. You can do so in a bed or out in the wilderness. You can't rest outside of a bed while in town. Once you level up, you see a screen before you showing all your character's attributes and what level they all are. This screen will allow you to choose between 3 attributes you want to raise in level right now. This is shown off by the orbs on the screen. The higher your attribute points, the stronger your character. Now sometimes, you'll notice a number in front of an attribute on the screen. That number can go up to 5, which means you can raise that attribute by 5 rather than 1. This is a really interesting system that really opens up how you decide you want to play, once you understand how it works. I figured out that what attributes got, that multiplier was determined by what skills you leveled and what attributes those skills are tied to. All 27 skills are tied to an attribute, though none of them are tied with luck. So I wanted to test something out once I found this out. Was there a way to get 3 options up to ×5 for every character level up? I knew that you needed 10 major or minor skills to get a level. So I decided to take a look at leveling up certain skills tied to only 3 different attributes. But a bit further than that, 2 of those skills have to be in the miscellaneous section, so you don't raise your character level by mistake. So I leveled 2 miscellaneous skills tied to 2 different attributes 10 times each, and lastly leveled a major skill 10 times. Rested, and sure enough, my experiment was correct. 5 times increases to 3 attributes. Oh, you can min-max your playthrough so easily with this. I said earlier that using the skills will level the skills, but that's not the only way to level them up. You can also find trainers that can level you up simply by paying them, just like major, minor, or miscellaneous skills. This trainer system is also derived from Daggerfall. Going through a trainer is very fast. but can also be really costly over time. Not to mention that all trainers have a max level that they can train up to. So you can end up hitting one trainer's max level and have to go searching for another one. Trainers also can't level your skills past the attribute they're tied to. So if you're trying to level Spear to 31, but your endurance is 30, they can't do that. Think of attributes not only as your character's stats, but also as ceilings that constantly raise higher and higher. When I would get a lot of money from selling loot I'd come across, I would wait until I got a level, and then plan my skill leveling route through trainers. Starting with a fresh character level and choosing 3 skills to level through trainers. I was the next level pretty much instantly. This is only if you really want to min-max your character though. All attributes max out at 100, but they can still be further enhanced by fortifying them. Fortifying can be done with spells, potions, and equipment. There are so many enchanted items and potions in the game that can raise your attributes through fortification. Spells and potions are always temporary boosts to your attributes. You can sometimes find, or make, enchanted gear that can give you a constant effect of fortification. That means, as long as the item in question doesn't break, you can fortify an attribute without having an arbitrary timer attached to it. Making the gear like this is through enchanting it. And to enchant items, you either need a really high enchant skill, or to pay a metric ton of money through an enchanter NPC. And those guys are very expensive. The reason you would decide to go through them instead is they have a 100% success rate of enchanting. The player character will not have that, at least according to posts I've read online, not with your enchant skill at 100 or lower. Imagine fortifying your enchant skill above 100 and having a nearly 100% success rate. You wouldn't have to spend a single drake on that ever again, or you could just save scum. Now, stats, skills, levels, and attributes are all well and fine, but how do they translate to the gameplay? I'm going to talk about speed and athletics. Basically, when both of those are low level, you run pretty slowly, especially when you're weighed down a lot from items in your inventory. But what if they were high level? Oh, you move fast! Yeah, that's probably the most obvious way to show how leveling your character in all fields can be shown off. Morrowind doesn't hold your hand with anything here. Not in combat, not in how to traverse Vardenfell, and not in the story. Bethesda treats everyone here like RPG gamers, ones where you get dropped into a new world and figure out everything as you go. There are positives and negatives to this approach. The positives being that it doesn't treat you like a kid who can't figure things out on their own. The negatives being that this can be off-putting to quite a lot of people. Love it or hate it, this is still a product of its time, and games from the 90s were tougher than modern games. Not just because most use limited lives in them, but also because game design has come a long way in 20 years. How about we talk about combat next? When you start up Morrowind and get past the introduction, you're basically let loose to do whatever you want. You're given the start of your main quest, but you can ultimately skip that for as long as you want. Kind of like Fallout 4 and searching for your son Sean. Sorry Sean, but another settlement needs my help. When you first hop into combat with an enemy, the first thing you'll notice is that you miss. A lot. This is because your skill with the weapon you're wielding is incredibly low right now. The higher the level, the higher the chance of you hitting your enemy. This follows both Arena and Daggerfall in that regard. While this is a 3D game, this is not the same gameplay as Oblivion and Skyrim. Those two had it where if you swung your weapon close enough to your enemy, it would hit them. That's more action-based combat. Morrowind follows the more traditional Elder Scrolls gameplay sets. New players may be completely turned off from the gameplay after they see it's completely RNG-based. But once you raise your weapon skill high enough, you can actually start stringing together a lot of attacks in a row. When that happens, it's actually a very satisfying feeling. Magic works differently than this. Rather than missing your enemy if you shoot a fireball, you can instead fail to cast the fireball entirely. The skills and level ups work together to make it a sort of action and traditional hybrid. This follows up Daggerfall the most in how these systems work, and if you look at each game evolving the formula from the previous each time, Morrowind is another cog on that wheel. It takes the systems that Daggerfall both evolved and created, and evolved those while breaking new ground itself. It's very interesting seeing how all these systems work independently, as well as together with each other. But let's get back to the combat. Combat starts out very tough, mostly because hitting the enemy with a weapon is very hit or miss. Pun intended. But once you raise your skill with that weapon, and you start actually hitting your enemies much more consistently, you tend to have a much easier time. that doesn't mean you can overpower everything you see. That just means you have a higher chance of living longer. And even though the game is very RNG based on whether you hit your enemy or not, the same is true for your enemies. You'll find them missing a lot as well. Though I'm pretty sure they hit you more consistently than you do at the start. Most of that is because every enemy has their own stat sheets that Bethesda made for them. While in Oblivion and Skyrim, the world levels with your character. In Morrowind, it's a lot more static than that. While there are enemies that will respawn in the wilderness, there are also enemies that Bethesda put in very specific areas that you'll always come across there. No matter who you are or what playthrough you're on, the enemy will always be there, and with the exact same level and stats. This is one of the reasons that min-maxing your character in Morrowind is so easy to do. You can go online and find pages upon pages of various directions people have made from beginning to end of the game. The game has been around for 23 years now, so pretty much everything has been seen by someone at one point or another. The amount of enemies in a certain stronghold, who they are, what their stats are, and even how likely they are to fight you on sight. The game has been mastered. But that's where some of the charm is. When you create a character, you might start with a traditional sword and shield. You'll go through your playthrough and end up leveling up your long blade and blocking skills. But maybe you end up seeing an enemy that only casts spells at you. You lose to them and move on, later finishing the game. Start up a new playthrough and choose a different playstyle, maybe a two-handed axe. You go to that same area and see the exact same enemy mage, but this time, you win. You had prior knowledge of that area from your previous playthrough. You got a general sense of what level you should be. Or maybe you learned how to min-max the game only halfway through your first playthrough, and now you've been doing that since creation. There's a lot of different ways to go into this fight and come out with a different outcome. Maybe in another playthrough after that, there's a random cliff racer that followed you all the way there, because of course they would. So now you're fighting off 2 enemies instead of 1, but one of them you expected, the other was random, but still expected in that area. And at this point, I'm convinced that cliff racers are everywhere in this game. They never stop appearing, and when you aggro an enemy, the music changes to combat music. So whenever that music change happened, I caught myself looking up immediately to spot a cliff racer above me, rather than searching around me for a ground enemy. Dear God, they're everywhere! While I was going through Morrowind, I changed up the weapons I used quite a few times. A lot of it was based on what I had available to me at the beginning of the game, but the further I got, the more I dwindled the choices to long blades and axes. I was leveling those up to continually increase my character's level just by adventuring. Not to mention, they started at higher levels, so hitting an enemy was easier to start with. Just one of the benefits of having major and minor skills. But outside of leveling your weapon skill, the fights with those weapons only go so far. It's not like you have different combinations of attacks you can use. There's simply a normal swing and a power swing. Both use up a bit of your stamina bar, with power attacks using more. But at the same time, if they hit, power attacks do more damage. And with every hit, you increase your experience to the next level with that skill, thus raising your chance to hit your enemy even higher. Though there are different swing speeds for different types of weapons. A daikatana will always swing faster than a two-handed axe. But something else of note is, the higher quality the weapon, the more it seems to weigh. Glass weapons are an exception to this rule, what with being lighter than lower qualities, but at the same time, they'll break much faster. Oh, that's right. Weapons and armor have durability in Morrowind. The more you use them or get hit will lower the meter down until the item breaks. This is still following a more traditional style of RPG from back in the day. A lot of old school 90s RPGs would be very tough to play, or even beat, because they had systems like this implemented into them, and this being a game from 2002 is no exception to that, though some might think the systems are watered down compared to Daggerfall. Now, as for magic, there are a very large amount of spells in the game to use, and honestly, the whole system is very cumbersome when you have a vast amount of spells at your disposal. I set my mouse keybinds to move back and forth through the list of spells. As I added in more spells, that list just kept growing and growing, which made that switching much harder to do. Add to that all the enchanted items in your inventory that involved casting spells, and there was a lot of clutter in that alone. Not to mention that accidentally switching to the item would automatically equip that item onto my character. That would mean I could go from using a long blade to a dagger by complete accident, while in combat. Like I said, very cumbersome. But when you have a good spell to use against your enemy, you can hit them from very far away multiple times before they reach you. That'll start you off on a better foot before hopping into melee range, just as it turns into a whiffing match. At low levels, when I was missing my attacks a lot, the gameplay felt pretty iffy. But once I got closer to the end of the campaign, it became much more fun. Not only was I winning much more often, but I could come out of scraps much easier than before too. Add in my ridiculous running speed around my enemies, and I just felt powerful. Not powerful to the point of overconfidence, but I could literally skip around dungeons and mow people down sometimes. That was pretty satisfying. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever fought something while levitating in the air? Because I have. Now imagine levitating and raining down fire from the heavens upon thy enemy. Actually pretty great. When you combine different utility spells into your combat, like levitate, you can get pretty creative. And boy, there are a lot of spells in this game. Like seriously, going up to NPCs and hitting learn spell, you'll more often than not see at least 10 different spells. Now the person down the hall has 10 different spells than the ones you just saw. And the person in the next room has another 10 different ones from either of those lists. It's pretty crazy. But I'm pretty sure I've spotted some people that do have some amount of spells that are sold from both. So there's that. And spells in Morrowind can get a bit ridiculous too. I came across someone who fell to their death. They had a few enchanted scrolls on them that I grabbed up. Using them fortified my acrobatics by 1,000. Take a look at how jumping works like this. And in a similar vein to what Daggerfall introduced, there's swimming in Morrowind as well. You can swim underwater, but you do have a breath meter to worry about as well. Explore those areas in both the surrounding ocean around Vardenfell, and even in dungeons and the like. Though it always feels like you'll get attacked by fish whenever you take a dip into the water. But thankfully, you can also fight in the water. So those fish still had a lot to worry about, like just how many times you would whiff before actually hitting them. There are so many dungeons in the game of varying sizes, but they did seem to be following about 2 different tiers of sorts. There are a ton of these ancestral tombs you'll spot just by walking around the map. Going into them, you'll find out that they tend to be really small, like 3 or 4 rooms kind of small. Now there's nothing wrong with that. That's just a bite-sized dungeon with loot and enemies in it for you. Once you get to the other tier, the dungeons become much more complex in nature. We're talking Old Dwemer ruins or even Daedric shrines. These tend to have tougher enemies in them to begin with, and you don't really know what you'll find either. When you enter a Dwemer ruin, you would assume that you would come across Dwemer constructs guarding the place, right? But instead, you might find a bunch of bandits. You never truly know. But these places do tend to be tough to navigate if you haven't played this game a million times. While you do have a local map that uncovers as you walk around, when everything looks the same where you're standing, it's difficult to know which doors you need to go through to continue forward. At least, not without obsessively looking at your map anyway. Another thing that carries over from previous games would be diseases. In Morrowind, there are a lot of diseased and blighted enemies that you'll end up coming across. While getting a disease isn't necessarily the worst thing ever anymore, it still prevents you from doing things normally. An example would be how NPCs don't want to talk to you if you're carrying a disease of any sort. Diseases can range from mildly annoying to pretty drastic when they're gotten at really bad times. Like for instance, in the battle you get it in, the diseases all seem to affect your attributes, skills, or your fatigue, which is basically stamina. Unlike how you could actually hardlock yourself from continuing any further in previous games, Morrowind really dumbs down how bad diseases are, and honestly, I think it's better for that. Now hear me out. Rather than getting hardlocked because you can't reach the nearest town before you're gone, it essentially makes certain types of gameplay tougher to do. Stuff like combat, traversal, talking with NPCs, and so on. It doesn't stop you, but it can put you in a bind if you can't cure yourself. A huge part of Morrowind is about the diseases, and thankfully, you can't just fast travel to the nearest town and turn up dead. But even with all of that, there's a certain moment in the main quest that ends up making diseases null and void to you anyway. So if you're having a tough time with the idea of collecting diseases like a badge of honor, you can just get far enough into the game where you don't have to worry about it anymore. And there's potions that can cure you for common disease, blight disease, and you can even get resistances to it as well. Your willpower attribute helps to do that for you. Another way to cure yourself is to find a temple and spend gold on a statue to cure your disease. While it might not be a random potion you found on the ground, those statues will always be there. If you do catch a disease while in a fight, just make sure you can cure it. The last thing you want is to be nearly full in carrying things, and then you get whacked with a disease that lowers your strength. That'll make you over encumbered and you can no longer move. The worst thing in the game isn't the enemies, it's having to drop an item you want to sell on the ground and never being able to remember where you left it. While this part isn't exactly a disease, there are enemies that you can come up against that can attack your attributes. They can do this via spellcasting or enchanted weaponry. This, however, cannot be cured by a cure disease potion. These will require you to have a restore attribute potion in the exact attribute that was lowered, like strength or endurance for instance. You can also use spells to restore your attributes as well. Just imagine if your strength attribute got damaged. You might have to drop some items on the ground if you can't cure it. Speaking of dropping items, you can drop them on the ground wherever you want, and they'll be there the next time you pass by. I don't think they ever go away, or that NPCs even pick up the stuff you drop. That was a huge weight off my chest, and my pockets when I found that out. I literally stored up a ton of items on the floor of the Mages Guild in Balmora for later use, or selling purposes. And speaking of selling things, this is like a normal Elder Scrolls game, one where all shopkeepers have a limited amount of gold in their inventory. That means they have a hard limit for you to hit whenever you go to sell things. Thanks to looking online, I have no shame, I found a vendor that had a limit not seen before in Morrowind. One so high you can't imagine the amount of zeros. It was 10,000 gold. Oh, that's actually only a lot better than the normal shops, but not amazingly high. So what do you do when you find an item worth over 200,000 gold, you ask? Oh, simple commoner. You sell it for 10,000. Easy money. Okay, it's actually terrible. You can find all these legendary, priceless artifacts in the game, and the most you can sell them for is a measly 10,000? Well, thankfully you're hitting that 10,000 limit sell on a lot of items in this game then, because ebony and daedric gear is your bread and butter here. All while the vendor does stuff with it? What does a mud crab want with all of this gear? Why does a mud crab have 10,000 gold every 24 hours? Seriously, if you hit a vendor's gold limit, just wait for 24 hours and it'll refresh. But anyway, let's talk about dialogue next. Now, Morrowind is a game that's filled with dialogue. You're going to be talking to people all the time, be it for quests, gathering information, and so on. So basically, the whole game. But here's another little tidbit for that. There's much more voiced dialogue in this game than Arena and Daggerfall combined. But it's just for the introduction to the game, greetings from NPCs as you walk by, the final boss, and the ending. I haven't really noticed this in anything else, so you're going to be reading a lot in this game. This is not for the faint of heart. We all know you haven't been to a library in years, Jeff. Alright, so the dialogue is pretty competently written. There's a lot of lore that people will say, as well as their flavor text, to talking directly to you. Every blue word you see in dialogue adds to your list of important words that you can ask about. The list you see for one character won't necessarily transfer to another one the same way. Questions you would ask a main story NPC are going to be different from a guard walking around. Every character you can speak with will also have a disposition bar, basically showing how much they like you on a scale of 0 to 100. 100 meaning they love and praise you, and 0 meaning they hate your guts. There are ways to influence this number. You can do quests for them, or the faction they may be a part of, or you can try your hand at persuading them if your speechcraft is high enough, or you could just do it the old-fashioned way with cold, hard cash. I'm pretty convinced that nearly every NPC in this game will accept your money to make them like you. Bribery apparently gets you very far in life. If your speechcraft level is really low, you will have an extremely low chance of success for getting someone to like you via admiring them. And when I say a very low chance, I mean it. It's nearly impossible to get someone out of 0 disposition with admiration, and NPC responses are determined by how much they like you. Outside of that, you can also threaten and taunt characters. Threatening them can also get you answers faster, but they definitely won't like you after that. And taunting them enough will actually make them attack you. An easy way to get rid of someone without collecting a bounty from the guards, since they attack you first. Which, by the way, the guards don't all attack you at once when you commit a crime. In fact, I'm not convinced they even chase you at all unless you talk to them first. If you have a bounty on your head for stealing something, sleeping in someone's bed, fighting in public, or what have you, the guards will just continue to patrol their set paths. It's almost like getting away with stealing scot-free, at least until you realize that NPCs won't talk to you if you have a bounty. Gosh dang it, it's the diseases all over again. So, if you have a bounty and you want to get rid of it, you just go up to a guard, talk to the guard, and you can either pay your fine, go to jail, or have some quick-saving fun times. If you go to jail, just like a normal Elder Scrolls game, your character will lose experience in one form or another, mainly because you're not out adventuring, so your skills are atrophying. Is that the right word? I don't know. Now, what does a criminal in Morrowind look like? Well, you can steal things, right? You're gonna need to increase your sneak skill. When you first start out sneaking in the lower levels, you suck. People and enemies will spot you so quickly and easily. You can either train it up the hard way by sneaking around and hoping that people just don't see you enough to get the level up, or you can purchase levels from a sneak trainer. Honestly, the much quicker and easier option by far. So for sneaking, you have to crouch, but I couldn't find a way to set it to toggle, so I was always walking around while holding my control button to sneak around. A bit of a pain, sure, but I got used to it after a while. But while you're sneaking, you can obviously steal items from people's houses, pickpocket them, or even get the first hit on an enemy. I think you have a higher chance of getting a critical hit like that as well. If you raise your security skill, it'll help you to lockpick doors and chests. But there are also a ton of trapped doors and chests all over Vardenfell. Well, you can get around that with another item called a probe. And trust me, you're absolutely going to want one of these in your inventory at all times. These traps hurt. But look at that lockpicking action. One great way to work on sneaking types of objectives would be to join the Thieves Guild. I didn't do too much with them in my playthrough, but you can imagine the types of quests you might get from them. Stuff like sneaking and stealing certain items in people's houses, or maybe even pickpocketing from named NPCs.
You'll get yours, thief.
But the Thieves Guild isn't the only guild in the game. There's also the Mages Guild and the Fighters Guild. But this faction concept goes even further than just those guilds. There are also the 3 great houses that you can choose from as well. However, unlike the guilds in the game, you can only join one of the great houses. Every one of these will give you quests that you can follow to gain experience, get loot, and also further their storylines. There's still more factions in the game that you can join. You just have to find where they're situated and ask the affiliated NPCs until you find the one who will let you join. There's still more you can join, but the general idea of having all of these available to you is to help fill out the world, as well as giving you plenty of quests to do. Like a good guild or group you can join, there's restrictions in place preventing you from getting just any quest in general. These restrictions follow being of a certain rank or even needing a certain item. You're required to be wearing a Legionnaire chest piece in order to talk with anyone of higher rank than you. Alright, cool. But how do you rank up? You rank up with 2 different criteria. You have to do enough quests involving the faction, as well as having high enough attributes and skills in certain categories tied to the factions. Thankfully, you don't have to guess any of these. If you go to your character sheet, you can find a section where it tells you all the factions you're part of. I don't know how you do this on a controller, but on keyboard and mouse, you only need to hover your mouse on top of the faction name, and it will give you the details. Not only do factions help to fill out the world a bit more, but they also add a fair amount of side content, as well as giving you progression in something that isn't just the main quest. You also have characters that you can interact with, how they sometimes interact with each other, or even with opposing factions. The faction system here is definitely very BGS in design. The only thing I saw going against that would be how you can only choose one of the great houses to join. So that's a general overview of the systems in the game that you'll be interacting with in one way or another. Let's talk about the world now. Morrowind's base game takes place on the island of Vardenfell, located inside the province of Morrowind. Vardenfell houses a giant volcano in the center of it, and I hope you like volcanoes, because that's what most of the surrounding area is based on in terms of aesthetics. So you're gonna see a bunch of rocky formations in your travels around the island. That's not to say that everything only looks like that. You do get green grass, sand, smaller islands, water, and the like, but most of it is rocky in nature. So this makes Vardenfell not exactly the prettiest thing to look at. As you travel around the island, you'll see lots of different locations, from towns to ancestral tombs to farms, strongholds, Dwemer ruins, Daedric shrines, and so on. There is quite a lot of variety when it comes to these, though things like Dwemer ruins and Daedric shrines tend to look the same from the rest of all of them, just plopped wherever. But they still add to the history of Vardenfell. What happened in these places? What's in these places? What kind of enemies or loot will I find? It's great for more adventurous types who want to go out and explore all that this game has to offer. One of the coolest things I saw in Vardenfell was something called the Ghost Fence. Erected around the perimeter of the volcano, this thing is massive, and it's there for story reasons, something that happens much later in the main quest. But that didn't stop me from accidentally finding my way inside a few times. Unlike the Elder Scrolls Arena, there are hills and mountains that you can climb, or levitate over. Something I found out pretty quickly when it comes to traversing Morrowind is that jumping is faster than running. The thing is though, if you jump on a hill, you'll find yourself sliding whichever way faces down. If you jump on anything angled, your character will basically be floating just above the ground for a bit until you hear the thud thud from hitting the ground. The physics in Morrowind are wonky like that. Wonky just like how if there's a pathway you need to traverse in a cave, it can be tough to follow it properly. Sometimes you'll come across a spot that requires you to jump on a ledge, and it's like pulling teeth trying to actually get on that ledge. Bonus points if that ledge is on top of a slight incline, so if you miss your jump, you slide backwards further. It's definitely oozing that early 2000s 3D physics. And let's not forget how NPCs standing in doorways prevents you from going through said doorway. Outside of the fact that NPCs will stay in their general vicinities, outside of quest reasons, standing in doorways happens a lot. Usually a 1 hour wait or two can fix that. Just make sure you're not too close to the NPC in question, or they'll think you're trying to talk to them the entire time. Out of everything you can find in Vardenfell, it's a rather static game. A frozen moment in time. Unless you're doing a quest that moves things forward, all NPCs don't really move from their general vicinity. This is something that Bethesda tries to remedy in their later games, and they succeed in doing so. But there's still a lot of personality here that Morrowind carries with itself. Sure, things don't really move without your involvement, but at the same time, you learn where things and people are. The exploration in the world really rewards your subsequent playthroughs. But even with that, there's only one time you can experience something for the first time. But overall, the gameplay in the game is still good. Even while it's aged as it is, there's so much you can do. And even though the world itself seems rather static in nature, it's still a big game. So much to explore, so many quests, a ton of combat that gets more fun the more you understand how the systems work, and so on. So with that, I'd like to move on to talking a bit about the narrative. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Don't want to spoil anything for people that are interested in trying the game out themselves. So when you start up The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, you're shown a very strange cutscene, and then you wake up on a ship. It's a prison ship of sorts. Still following how Todd loves to introduce players to the Elder Scrolls games as a prisoner. It essentially puts us closer in the shoes of our character. We're in Morrowind for the first time ever, and we're experiencing everything at the same time as our character. Essentially, a blank slate as our self-insert. Head off the ship, go continue creating your character's stats and stuff, and you're then given a quest. This is the start of the main quest. It's here to give you something to work toward at the very beginning of the game. But once you leave the first building, the whole land of Vardenfell is now open to you. You're a free person now, free to do whatever you decide to do. You could follow the lead of the main quest. You could start talking to people in this town, plan your own adventure, go exploring, you name it. While the main quest is important and has some high stakes, but nothing is timed in Morrowind, so you can go at your own pace however you like. The freedom to go off the beaten path at any time is definitely one of Bethesda's strong suits, even if you're ignoring something in the main quest that sounds super important. Cue joke about rescuing your son in Fallout 4. Alright, so one of the biggest questions here is how is the main story in Morrowind? Bethesda, while I enjoy their main stories, are known for having their side stories much better than the main quest. Not necessarily up to everyone's tastes. Well, in my honest opinion, the story is decent. It's nothing mind-blowing, but it does treat your character as less of a chosen one and more of a person who has to work for their worth. If you play the game, you'll understand what I mean. As for the side content, it's a bit more sporadic. You'll receive quests to go do some stuff for others, naturally. But that seems to end once you finish the quest. Not really tied to anything else overall. Just something that seems to build out the world via one quest giver at a time. I've become the highest ranking member of House Redoran, and that was my general experience there. There's interesting stuff, but it did seem to be disconnected in other ways. Sort of like if you were given a quest to go do an errand for someone. Rather than having some grand event happen, you just got some items. Or cleared out a quick ancestral tomb for someone. I can't say much about the guilds in the game, as I did quite a few quests for the Mages Guild, but didn't finish that quest line, or rather, attain the top ranking position. When you're doing quests for a guild, Great House, the Legion, or whatever, you speak with a quest giver when you start. As you do more quests, you'll attain more ranks, assuming you have high enough skills and attributes. But that quest giver will eventually run out of quests to give you, so they'll recommend another person for you to get more quests from. This happens a bunch of times. The main quest was good. It had a lot of depth with its themes and nuanced storytelling, but the side quests felt more like random assortments of chores for some people. Don't get me wrong, there were some interesting side quest storylines too, but there were a lot of them that were just small quests that had much lower stakes to them. But what's interesting is, the game really doesn't hold your hand with anything here. The game gives you actual detective work of sorts. If you have a quest to find someone, you're given hints as to where they may be in some general areas. A lot of the time though, you need to talk to NPCs in the area to find out who would know where the person you're looking for is. Other times, you might need to find an ancestral tomb, and it's the same concept. Go around, talk to NPCs, ask them where it might be, and one will eventually give you the directions to go after it. After that, it's up to you to actually find it based on the directions. But now you're left with directions to remember your way. Bethesda thought of that and kept the journal system that Daggerfall had. When major quest things happen, your character will write in a journal the description of what they were told, or things that happened. It's actually well documented, and even the date that these events happen. The journal system is good, but after a while of playing the game, a quest that you got a week ago, now you would either need to look for that entry in the journal, or you could go to the quest tab. And let me tell you, the quest tab is a lifesaver. But there's even a section in the journal that acts like a help section. If you open that up, it has tips for tons of various things in the game that you might have questions on. So yeah, the narrative is good. The side quests have moderate to little interest, but the really interesting part is how you actually have to work to do the quests. Morrowind treats you like an actual adventurer in Vvardenfell. You're not given any map markers showing you where you need to go for anything. You have to use your head and tracking skills to find things. Add in the combat that you'll have throughout your experience, and it's absolutely an adventuring sort of game, but one that happens to have a major story with it. As for the music in the game, I think I've only heard like 6 songs, like 3 of them for random traveling and 3 for combat. The soundtrack was made by the illustrious Jeremy Soule, who went on to score more of Bethesda's Elder Scrolls games. The songs that were created were great, including Morrowind's iconic opening theme. Something funny that really shows Morrowind's age is how the transition between normal and battle music happens. There were so many times when I was sneaking up on enemies that normal travel music was playing. Then, when I one-shot the enemy, the music would attempt to switch to combat music, but since combat was over, it would switch to another travel song. It was actually kind of funny how that worked. But overall, Morrowind was a very interesting game to play. It definitely feels rough around the edges, but the more you play through it, and the more you understand how the systems work, I really started having a lot of fun. Bethesda definitely had a vision for how they wanted to make the game, and I could see why it was the success it was in the early 2000s. If you wanted to play a game that had a ton of systems from the 90s Western RPGs in it, with not quite as much of the brutality and hard locking yourself from finishing the game, then Morrowind is a great game to fill that void for you. This was only my experience with the base game. I still have a ton of things that I missed doing in Vvardenfell, as well as the 2 DLC expansions, Tribunal and Blood Moon respectively. I'm going to play through both of those at a later date, and make a video on them as a follow-up to this one. But something I wanted to bring up quick was the modding scene. Morrowind has been around for 23 years now. While there aren't many people working on modding the game, in comparison to newer games like Skyrim and Fallout 4, there are so many years that have gone by that there are plenty of mods for Morrowind. While I haven't touched any mods myself, there is one that really piqued my interest. It's called Tamriel Rebuilt, and it sounds like it was being worked on since shortly after Morrowind released. That's like 20 years of added content by modders for this huge game. That's insane. It's one of the biggest modding projects I've ever seen. I definitely want to look into this at some point after I'm done with the expansions. With that said, that's my video on the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you liked the video, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Adios.